On behalf of Young Americans for Liberty and the Future Freedom Foundation, I really appreciate you being with us here tonight to discuss the issue of civil liberties. There's some yellow cards you should have had when you walked in. I think some of them, you'll find them on your seats. If you'll please fill those out, and by the end of the event, if you will give those to the people at the door, we have some books to give away, a raffle, and some valuable information I think Mr. Jacob Hornberger would like to send you eventually, resources, and we'll have your address so we can do that. But really glad for y'all to be here with us tonight. How many of you had the utter pleasure of watching that presidential debate last night? I feel very sorry for you. And I'm sure after watching that, you just feel completely hopeful and just full of joy about the future of this country. You just feel like we're going in the right direction. Well, that's a little bit of what we're going to be discussing tonight. The issue of civil liberties is one in which America continues to head completely in the wrong direction. And what I mean by that, you know, a lot of people worry about conspiracies, that there's things happening behind closed doors that are nefarious or evil. And if we could just find those things out, we could sort of find out this wrongdoing and throw these criminals in jail. I think there's something much more dangerous than a conspiracy, and that's a consensus. When both the left and right, both Republicans and Democrats, agree that the Constitution simply doesn't matter anymore. That things like the Fourth Amendment are archaic and we don't need it. Things like our historic constitutional liberties, our individual liberties don't matter. You can throw Americans in jail and no habeas corpus, no due process. That's where we're at in our country. And you see it in things like the presidential debate last night. They didn't even mention civil liberties because they don't have to. There is a consensus. We had a president from 2000 to 2008 named George W. Bush, and if you were on the left and you had to pick a gripe with Bush Cheney, it had a lot to do with foreign policy and civil liberties and the so-called national security state. I don't care if it was our wrong-headed war in Iraq, it was Guantanamo Bay, it was the Patriot Act, it was warrantless wiretapping. It was all of those issues that in 2008 made America say, and it wasn't the only issues, but they were certainly strong issues, especially if you were coming from the left, but that in 2008 made America reject John McCain because they didn't want 4 more years of Bush and that sort of authoritarianism. They wanted change with Barack Obama. What did we get? What kind of change did we get? Well, a change in the wrong direction. If you thought George W. Bush was bad with his authoritarian measures, now you have Barack Obama. If you thought the Patriot Act was terrible because you could arrest people without due process, Barack Obama has now out-Bushed Bush by introducing the National Defense Authorization Act. NDAA allows our government, the executive, the President of the United States, to decide that some people should be picked up and thrown in jail indefinitely, American citizens, not just so-called enemy combatants, which is a problem in and of itself, but American citizens on our own soil can be picked up, thrown in jail without due process. That is something that even Bush and Cheney never even thought about doing. That's how far along we are. The ACLU released a report this week just about the surveillance state and the warrantless wiretapping and the different types of spying with your email and people spying on what you're doing on your mobile phones, your smartphones. 361% is how much we've gone up just from 2009 to 2011 of our government spying on what we do on our cell phones alone. The number of instances where they go through our emails and the warrantless wiretapping or the eavesdropping on our telephone calls have doubled or tripled from 2009 to 2011, depending on the category. That's the change we got from Barack Obama. Now, I am a conservative. I come from the right. I'm a Ron Paul fan. I'm a Rand Paul fan. And I've always been a constitutional conservative. But I can say, even though now that it's in vogue to be a constitutional conservative, most of my fellow conservatives from 2000 to 2008 spent most of their time assaulting the Constitution. They didn't care about it one lick. And the left was right in their accusations and their criticisms of George W. Bush. But now we have an anti-war left that's completely evaporated now that a Democrat is in the White House. Those same civil liberties gripes, you don't see too much resistance. Tonight you're going to see perspectives from a libertarian perspective and a liberal perspective talking about these civil liberties issues that addresses what both of those different groups have failed to do at various different times or haven't done effectively. We need to restore the Constitution. We need to uphold things like the Fourth Amendment. And if we don't have our constitutional liberties, that sort of bedrock of American civilization, what it means to be an American, we really don't have much of a country anymore, at least in the way our founders intended it. Well, we're going to hear from the speakers tonight, and I regret to tell you, I know a number of you are here to see Mr. Bruce Fine. He is not feeling well this evening, and he will not be joining us, and I can tell you he's very, very sorry he's not here. He was really looking forward to seeing many of you. But our first speaker tonight is going to be representing the libertarian perspective on civil issues. His name is Jacob Hornberger. Jacob Hornberger is the founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received his Bachelor's of Art degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of Dallas. He used to be a regular libertarian commentator on the late, great Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch on Fox Business, and boy, do I miss that show. But without further ado, a great champion and spokesman for freedom, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jacob Hornberger.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with y'all. This is actually the third venue that we're doing in this part of our tour. We started at the University of Washington in Seattle, and we were at University of California, Davis, and we're here. And this is actually part two of this tour. Part one was over on the East Coast last winter, and it was just such an awesome experience that we said, hey, let's go out west and do this again. And so far it's been great, and it's really a regret that we don't have Bruce with us. He got sick today. Really bad stomach pain. He's in the hospital, but the doctor says he's going to be fine, but they had to give him some painkillers and knock him out. And so it's not just a mild stomach disorder. The guys really couldn't make it. And we're disappointed. I know some of you are, but you got a liberal and a libertarian up here. And it's kind of an interesting thing because when we did our East Coast tour, a lady came when we were at Columbia University. She came up to me and she said, God, I can't wait for the debate tonight. And I said, well, what debate? She says, well, debate. I mean, you know, libertarian, liberal, and a conservative. You know, it's going to be a great debate. And then, interestingly enough, the same thing prior to the University of Washington event. I got a phone call, and this guy says, man, can't wait to make the debate tonight. And I said, what debate? And then last night, a lady comes up again and says, oh, boy, this is going to be a great debate. Well, it's not a debate. The reason we put this program together with Glenn Greenwald, who's one of my heroes, and Bruce Fine, who's one of my heroes, and Jack Hunter, is because all of us are on the same page when it comes to this particular issue. And what we're trying to convey here is that it doesn't matter what ideological perspective you come from, whether you call yourself a liberal, conservative, libertarian, whether you're just neutral, whether you're trying to figure things out for yourself, doesn't matter. That this issue of civil liberties in the context of the war on terrorism and foreign policy, it happens just to be the most important issue of our time. Okay? It trumps everything else. And that's why we put this program together, to bring awareness to why this issue is so vitally important to our freedom and to our economic well-being in this country. Now, you know, one of the questions we very rarely ask ourselves is, how is it that we, you know, come to have this federal government in our midst? I mean, you know, we all accept it as a given that you're born and there's the federal government, you know, it's there. But how did it come into existence? And it's an important question because it helps to remind us, the answer to it helps to remind us who is supposed to be the master in this relationship of citizens and government and who is supposed to be the servant. Well, the federal government came into existence through the Constitution. Didn't exist before 1787 or 1789 or 1791, that what called it into existence was the people through the Constitution. A lot of Americans weren't very excited about this idea. They were happy to be living under the Articles of Confederation they had for many years, and they said, you know, we're not interested in this, and we oppose it. And why did they oppose it? Because they said, if you call this thing into existence, it will inevitably become the biggest threat to our freedom. It will become our oppressor. That it will establish a gigantic military force, and it will start doing what governments throughout history have done. They'll oppress us, they'll spy on us, they'll jail us when we criticize them, and they'll have a military to enforce it that will faithfully and obediently follow orders. We're not interested. And the framers said, you don't need to worry about that here. Because unlike all other governments in history, this one is going to be one of enumerated limited powers. And those powers are going to be in the document itself. If the power isn't enumerated, then it can't be exercised. It's as simple as that. Well, people said, okay, that's interesting. We might go along with it on that condition. It was the first time ever that people had had the audacity to tell government what it could and could not do, as compared to the reverse, where the government's telling citizens what they can and cannot do. But people said it's not sufficient. We want more. As soon as this thing is called into existence, we want a Bill of Rights, which really should not have been called a Bill of Rights. It's not a Bill of Rights at all. It really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions, because what it does is it prohibits government from interfering with pre-existing rights, natural rights, God-given rights. An acknowledgement that our rights don't come from the government. They don't even come from the Constitution. They pre-exist the Constitution. They pre-exist government. So when you go back and read the Bill of Rights, read it very carefully. And you'll see that it doesn't give you freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. It says that Congress will not interfere with these, will not infringe upon them. But there were 4 amendments, 4, dealing with the power of government to take people into custody and do bad things to them, which is really the ultimate power of government. I mean, we can talk here about, taxation and regulation and whatever, and gun control and a whole wide variety of issues. But the fact is that if government has the power to just go into your house in the dead of night, bash down your door, seize you and your family, cart you away to a military dungeon through military forces or the police, rape you, torture you, and execute you, that's the ultimate power. I mean, that means that government is in omnipotent control, total control. And that's what they were trying to avoid. Our American ancestors with the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. That's why they say no person, not just no American, no person, regardless of citizenship, will ever have his life, liberty, or property taken without due process of law. And that term, due process of law, stretches all the way back centuries to Magna Carta, the Great Charter, where the citizens of England held their own king, King John, at the point of a sword and said, acknowledge to us, the people, that your powers over us are limited, that you will not come and seize us and take us away to the Tower of London to be tortured in violation of the law of the land, or what became known as due process of law. And that's what that 5th Amendment was designed to do. And the 4th Amendment to protect us in our domain of privacy from unreasonable searches and seizures issued without judicially issued warrants. To protect us against cruel and unusual punishments. Now, why was it necessary to put these protections in? Why did people feel it necessary to do this? Well, isn't the answer obvious? because they believed that if you don't do this, these people, federal officials, democratically elected, would do these things. In other words, if you don't constrain them, they naturally will end up doing these things, perhaps with the best of intentions. In other words, they recognized that this federal government they were calling into existence was potentially going to be a giant threat to them. Let's jump ahead to today. We now live in a society in which the U.S. military wields the power to take any American into custody simply by labeling him a terrorist, carting him away to a military dungeon or a concentration camp without any judicial interference, torture him, and even execute him, perhaps after some sort of kangaroo tribunal. Sure, there's habeas corpus, which may test the detention, but the federal courts have gutted that protection so bad that for all practical purposes, it's no protection at all. Because the courts are deferring to the government's definition of what a terrorist is. That's an incredible power. In fact, if the federal government indicts any one of you as a terrorist and takes you into federal court and you're acquitted by a federal court jury of your peers pursuant to these 4 amendments, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments, the military can stand right there in that courtroom, and as soon as the jury declares you innocent or not guilty, which ordinarily means you walk away a free person, now the military has the authority to say, Your Honor, we are now taking him into custody as a terrorist under our definition of terrorism. It's an incredible revolutionary transformation in American law and the relationship of the citizen and the government. The government has the power to assassinate anyone, any American. And since the entire world is a battlefield in this so-called war on terrorism, that means the assassination can take place on American soil. And there's no judicial review. Federal judges aren't going to get involved in this thing. As soon as the federal government says national security, Your Honor, every federal judge in the land is just going to bow. You've already had at least 3 Americans assassinated. Anwar al-Awlaki, his 16-year-old son, and then there was a guy early in the Bush administration that got assassinated in Yemen that was traveling in a car. Got a missile fired at him. It's extraordinary power. They monitor our emails, they spy on us, and if they get caught breaking the law, nothing's going to happen to them. They just get immunity. It's an amazing transformation in our society, and it's one of the reasons why we're here today. Because, most of you have grown up here, the ones here, the college students, you've grown up with this, right? I mean, you were, what, 8 or 9, 10 years old when 9/11 hit? So this is all sort of normal to you, and this is freedom. You see, because it's inculcated in you from the first grade on up that you live in a free country. Thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free, right? And you're taught that you're free. And you're supposed to be grateful that you're free. And the troops are over there for your freedom. I mean, we're here having this assembly because the troops are over there. If the troops weren't over there, we wouldn't be able to have assemblies, wouldn't have baseball games, sports events. Thank goodness for the troops, right? I mean, isn't that what we all hear? And the idea is that this is all freedom. Well, it's not freedom. There's a reason why the founding fathers of this country opposed this kind of way of life and tried to protect us from it. Because they understood it isn't a free way of life. In fact, to put things in context, when you saw those people in Egypt protesting against the Mubarak military dictatorship, guess what one of their principal demands was? It was not only that Mubarak leave office. Okay, I mean, he's just the head of the dictatorship. The problem wasn't just a dictator. The problem was a dictatorship. One, by the way, which the U.S. government the military and the CIA has long supported, long partnered with. They love it. They've loved the military dictatorship in Egypt, just like they love the one in Bahrain, and Yemen, and elsewhere, Saudi Arabia. But one of the principal demands of the protesters is, we want you to relinquish, to surrender the temporary emergency powers that you assumed 30 years ago when the president of the country was assassinated. You know, big emergency, right? Or an assassination of the head of a country. And so they adopted these temporary emergency powers. And of course, we put temporary in quotation marks because it's 30 years later and they're still there. And among these powers is the power of the military to go pick up people, cart them away to a military dungeon, torture them, even execute them. And they're good at it. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the U.S. government after 9/11 chose Egypt as one of its rendition torture partners, where they could send people to Egypt, and did, to be tortured, because they're good at it. Well, because that power was being exercised so widely, the Egyptian protesters said, we want you to give up this power. And they said no. Mubarak said no. The military dictatorship said no. And to this day, despite the election of Morsi, they still won't give up that power. Now you can say, well, Jacob, it's different here because they're not exercising this power widely. You don't see roundups. But you see, that's not the test of a free society. Because once the power is being wielded, then it just takes the right emergency when the government starts exercising it. And by that time, it's too late, because everybody's too scared to get out and protest, because they may be among those being rounded up, carted away, tortured, raped, or what have you. (9/11). They said, well, it's necessary to adopt these temporary emergency powers because of 9/11. You know, the terrorists are here. The terrorists are coming to get us. They're going to conquer our country. They're going to take over the interstate highway system. They're going to take over the federal bureaucracies. They're going to take over the country. And so we're at war, and we have to assume these temporary emergency powers. The temporary has now extended 11 years. And let's examine what brought about 9/11, because that's an important factor here too. You know, they said, oh, well, the terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values. That was the first thing they told us, right? Right after 9/11? Oh, it was like terrorism was the flu. You know, where it just sort of like, it hits a country and like, oh my gosh, now it's our turn. The flu has hit America. You know, terrorism comes to our shores. Woe is us. Well, we knew better. Didn't just strike us. I mean, you know, they hate us. Well, why don't they hate Switzerland? You know, you don't see their ambassadors getting killed. You don't see their buildings getting attacked. How come? How come they just happen to hate Americans because we believe in rock and roll and the Swiss don't? It's ridiculous. As we were writing at the Future of Freedom Foundation before 9/11, the U.S. government was doing bad things to people, especially in that part of the world. I mean, because now you see, contrary to the way the things were when the country got established, we have a vast military empire. We have what's called a national security state. What General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who had been a military general, called the military-industrial complex. We've got military bases all over the world in 130 countries, 1,000 military bases. Vast military permanent army establishment. We've got a CIA. And these two organizations are involved in invasions, occupations, sanctions, embargoes, regime change operations, torture, kidnapping, rendition. In fact, you can see what they're doing in Iran right now with their sanctions. They're squeezing the lifeblood out of the Iranian people. And they're gleeful about it. Oh yeah, wow, the Iranian people are really starting to crater now economically. Man, maybe they'll oust their dictatorship. And Iran's an interesting case here. Because if you'll recall, back in 1979, the Iranian revolutionaries took American diplomats hostage. That's what this new movie, Argo's about. And at the time, we were given the same pitch, that they just hate us for our freedom and values. Well, they knew differently, that it went much deeper than that. It went back some 25 years when the CIA had gone into Iran and imagine this, ousted in a secret coup their democratically elected prime minister, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been Time Magazine Man of the Year, highly respected and revered in Iran. The CIA goes into this foreign country and boots out their democratically elected prime minister, installs a brutal dictator who was pro-U.S., trains him and his forces how to torture people. He proceeds to oppress the Iranian people for the next 25 years. They figure it all out, and they have a violent revolution against this dictator in 1979, and they weren't very happy with the U.S. And that's what U.S. officials called hating us for our freedom and values. In Iraq, after supporting Saddam Hussein for many years, a brutal dictator, the U.S. had partnered with him, just like they did with the Shah. They turned on him, and after the Persian Gulf War, installed one of the most brutal regimes of sanctions in history. I mean, the same thing you see in Iran today, where people are losing their life savings because the economy is just plummeting. That's what was happening in Iraq, and it was worse. And you may still see this in Iran. Children were dying of infectious illnesses, diseases. They couldn't get medicines. Children were dying to the extent of tens of thousands every year. 2 high UN officials resigned from the UN. Dennis Halliday and the other one escapes me his name. Galloway, I think his name was. What they called genocide. And here was the mindset. When Madeleine Albright, who was the official U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, I mean, she's our official spokesman for our government. 60 Minutes asked her, it's been reported that 500,000 children have died from the sanctions. Is this worth it? And by this time, of course, they were trying to oust Saddam from power and install one of the pro-U.S. dictators. And she says, well, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. Well, think about what that means. That means that there's a cost-benefit analysis taking place here. That for the purpose of democracy spreading, a regime change operation to put in our dictator, we're willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of children. Now, they all may mean really good by this, you know, the U.S. officials, but yeah, this is worth it. I'm sure she was sincere. This is really worth it. Okay, we sacrifice these kids, but look, we save these other people from this dictatorship. But who died and made them God? Under what moral principles do they have this authority to sacrifice people in this way? And sure enough, the anger and the rage was boiling in the Middle East. Not only because of that, but there was the unconditional support to the Israeli government, regardless of how they treated the Palestinians. There was the stationing of U.S. troops on Islamic holy lands that was humiliating Muslims. I mean, in other words, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they went in there poking hornets' nests in the Middle East. And we said it. You can check our writings before 9/11. If you continue doing this, you're going to see terrorism on American soil. And it didn't take a rocket scientist. I mean, there had been an attack in 1993 on the World Trade Center, which was no different in principle from the one that came 8 years later. There was the attack on the USS Cole. There was the attack on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. There was some shootings outside CIA headquarters. But they just kept doing it, and they kept doing it, and they kept doing it until finally 9/11 comes along and they say, oh, they just hate us for our freedom and values. We're amazed that this happened. We weren't amazed. And then they used that opportunity, that emergency, as a way to take away our freedom. To say now we have to exercise these temporary powers. We have to invade Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, bringing up this bogus WMD scare, which they know goes all the way back to the Cold War. You see, when we were in college and when we were growing up as teenagers, like, you know, you guys hear all the terrorism and the color-coded bogus nonsense. We heard it all with the communists. Oh, there's communists are coming. They're any day now they're going to be coming up. They're coming from Cuba. They're coming from Nicaragua. They're coming from Chile. They're coming from everywhere. Look under your beds. There might be some there. And, okay, but they knew that there's nothing that scares people more than nuclear war and nuclear weapons and mushroom clouds. And that's why they brought up this idea of mushroom clouds with Saddam Hussein and so, because they knew there's this visceral reaction that people have, and it was all bogus, and they knew it was bogus. That's why they never had an investigation of it. But they invade Iraq. They accomplished what they'd been trying to accomplish with their sanctions. They'd never been able to accomplish. They got rid of Saddam. They go into Afghanistan, and they're finally acknowledging that that has been a dismal failure as well. Most of the people they've killed in Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. And yet you have this continuous anger. And watch, if there's a terrorist attack by some Iranian family that's lost their life savings, they're going to say, same thing, they just hate us for our freedom and values. All right, so that's where we are. What can we do about it, or what should we do about it? Well, the first thing you got to do is it important to you? Or do you just want to live your life this way, under this oppressive cloud, this sword that's sheathed right now but can easily be unsheathed, especially in an economic emergency? I mean, if you look at Chile's 9/11, you can Google Pinochet coup and find out what happened in 9/11, 1973, under an economic emergency that was supported. This coup was supported by U.S. officials, CIA, military. In fact, they even helped kill 2 American journalists, young guys, about 30 years old. CIA helped kill them because they were liberals, communists. That was an economic emergency, and they were rounding people up. They were rounding up any protesters. They were torturing them. They were killing. They killed 3,000 communists. No trial, no due process, because they were exercising these kind of powers that our military, which supported them, now wields. This is not a good state of affairs. And so the first question is, how important it to you is? And that's why we're doing this program. That's why we do what we do, is to bring awareness in order to move our country in a better direction, in the direction of what this country was supposed to be all about. And ideas matter. There's a reason why totalitarian dictators will shut meetings like this down, because they know that ideas matter. They transform people. They motivate people. And once an idea enters your mind, you're never the same. And then you start thinking, okay, well, I want to learn more about this. I want to delve into this. And if you put your name on those cards for your email address, I'm going to send you a list of more resources, because we need help. We need help with people with passion, with people with conviction, and people that care about stopping this abuse. And there are few forces in the universe more powerful than a small group of determined people that are determined to end wrongdoing. And it is wrongdoing what we're doing to the people of the world. And so we're talking in terms of restoring this sense of getting rid of this military empire, regardless of how well-intentioned they might be. Getting rid of these infringements on civil liberties, restoring these concepts, these principles, in the Declaration of Independence and later in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution. And we're convinced that if we do that, we can have our American spring. We can stop the world dead in its tracks as they say, oh my gosh, the American people are starting to stir. They are starting to recapture that spirit that guided that Constitution and that Declaration of Independence. And they are now starting to lead their country to the highest reaches of freedom, and in the process, we lead the world. Thank you very much.
There we go, making sure it was working. I appreciate that fine speech from Mr. Hornberger. I should probably mention, I neglected to mention earlier, when this is over, we're going to have a very long Q&A, so you can ask as many questions as you like, which is usually one of the more fun portions of the evening. Our next speaker is going to be representing what many might consider the liberal or left perspective on civil liberties. Glenn Greenwald is a columnist for The Guardian, a former constitutional and civil rights litigator, and is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush administration's executive power and foreign policy abuses. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the 25 most influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. I would add that Glenn Greenwald, and many people share this opinion because it's true, is probably, not even arguably in my opinion, the best thinker and writer on the issues of civil liberties today and standing up for them. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenwald.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and thank you as well to the Young Americans for Liberty. This is, as Jacob indicated, the sort of sequel to the tour that we did in the Midwest and East Coast several months ago, when all of the events we've done, this is now the 3rd one on the West Coast leg, have really been organized perfectly, and it makes participating in these events really pleasurable. So thanks to that organization. They're great. I write and I speak a lot about civil liberties, and there's lots of different ways to approach that topic. It's a fairly complex topic, and it involves a lot of different issues, but every time that I come to an event like this and I speak about it, the very first thing that I do is pose the question of what that term actually means. What is it that we are denoting when we use the term civil liberties? And the reason why I think it's so important to do that right at the outset is in part because I just think discussions in general, political discourse in general, is much healthier if we have a common understanding of the terms we're using. But more importantly, I think, is the fact that many of the most important phrases in our political discourse, the ones that get tossed around most frequently and often with the greatest consequence, are fairly ill-defined. In fact, there are lots of terms that we use constantly where very little attention is paid to what the term actually means. And I think the leading example of that is the term terrorism, which is probably, if not the most consequential term in our political and legal landscape, it's certainly one of the most consequential. It's something that serves as a pretext for numerous wars. It justifies things like torture and warrantless eavesdropping on American citizens. It engenders an extremely large and always growing regime of secrecy. It sends our fellow citizens to prison for decades for so-called material support. And yet it is almost impossible to express a definition of that term that explains how that term is actually applied. It's almost impossible to say what the term means that will be consistent with how the term is typically used and how it is invoked. In fact, the only real definition that you could possibly contrive of what that term means is he who meaningfully opposes the will of the United States. That's pretty much the only way that you can talk about that term that makes any sense in terms of how the term is applied. And it's only once you think about the term terrorism in that way and you stop and think, what is it that we mean by this term, can you then understand how it's actually being used and how it's actually being applied. I think civil liberties, that term is somewhat similar, though not quite as pernicious in its effects. It too is a term that lots of people toss around fairly casually. It's invoked all the time to justify a wide range of policies, often ones that are quite contradictory. And it's really a term that has become, in mainstream discourse, almost a vapid cliche. It's something that people invoke as a slogan. No one really says, I want you to know my position on civil liberties is that I'm against it. It's not a term that's substantively debated. It's really a slogan that's just tossed around to justify a whole variety of things. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time before we talk about civil liberties, first stopping and thinking about what it is that we mean. And the good thing about doing that, the good thing about asking what the term civil liberties means, is that it is actually a term that is fairly simple to understand. It's not really a complex term. All we really mean when we talk about civil liberties, when we use that term, is it is the list of limitations that we have imposed on the government in terms of the power that they are able to exercise over us. It's the things that we've told the government that we are willing to recognize the legitimacy and validity of their power, provided that they stay on that side of these lines, that they never transgress these lines. That's all we really mean when we talk about civil liberties. And the additionally good thing about thinking about what the term means is that this list of prohibitions that we've imposed on the government in terms of what they can do to us are not very difficult to find. You don't have to go around searching for them. You don't need a scavenger hunt to see if they're hiding somewhere. They're all assembled in one place, not just in one place, but in one document called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. They're all simply right there. You go and you pick up this one document, and there you have the list of limitations and prohibitions that we, the citizenry, have imposed on the government in terms of the power they can exercise over us. And what is additionally good and encouraging about this mission of trying to understand civil liberties is that this list of prohibitions, the prohibitions that are on this list, are extremely clear and absolute in their nature. They're not muddled or ambiguous. They're not circumstantial or conditional. They have great clarity, and they are absolute in their application. So you can just look at the most commonly used prohibitions that are on this list to see how true that is. So the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And the Fourth Amendment says there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures of our persons, papers, or homes without a search warrant issued upon probable cause. And the Fifth Amendment, as Jacob said, clearly prohibits and says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. These are extremely clear terms, and they're absolutist in nature. I had this fairly acrimonious exchange once with Joe Klein, who is the writer at Time magazine. And I've actually had many, many acrimonious exchanges with Joe Klein, but the one in particular that I'm thinking about was this one about 4 or 5 years ago. It was in 2007 or so, and we were having this argument. I don't remember the specifics, but it was something about civil liberties. And the exchange went on for a week or even 2 weeks, and it was really kind of intense and accusatory and insulting all the way around, just the way I like them. And there was at one point, like in the middle of it, when he wrote some response to something I had said, and he said, well, and besides, I think the really important point here is to realize is that Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And when I first read that, I mean, this was my genuine reaction. I was actually really baffled. I was disoriented because I couldn't figure out why it was that in the middle of this extremely vituperative exchange that had been going on with him for almost 2 weeks, where insults were escalating, that he suddenly decided to stop in the middle of it and compliment me that way, like keep this lavish me with this praise. It was really bizarre. I couldn't figure out why he did it. And then I stopped for a second and I realized, wait, actually, oh my God, actually, when he says civil liberties extremist, he means that like it's an insult, like that's a bad thing. And the reason why I was so astonished by that is because civil liberties extremist to me is one of the best things you can possibly be called. I wouldn't even mind having that on my tombstone, like here lies a civil liberties extremist. And the reason that I think that is because there is no other way to defend civil liberties except by being an extremist about them. And the reason I say that is because if you look at what they say, the prohibitions that they impose on government power, they don't say the government is barred from crossing this line unless it can prove that doing so will provide good benefits to the citizenry, or unless it can prove that doing so will make everybody safer, or unless there is a state of war. It says the government is barred from exercising these powers in these ways. And that, to me, is the most critical part of the concept of civil liberties. Now, this is a concept, the idea that civil liberties are not conditional or circumstantial or dependent upon various conditions being met, that was once really uncontroversial, was really central to the way the Republic was formed, and yet it has become not just controversial, but almost mainstream, the idea that it should only happen in certain conditions. And so if you look at the debates over civil liberties over the last decade, what you find is some remarkable examples of people in the Republican Party, for example, who pride themselves on being these big, strong, tough guys who think they're the symbol of rugged individualism and freedom, standing up and saying things like the way John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, did, or Jeff Sessions, the senator from Alabama, did, saying things like, well, civil liberties really should be subordinate to safety because there's no point in having civil liberties if you're dead. really the exact opposite of the give me liberty or give me death ethos that formed the Republic. And, it's really cowardly in its essence. And what's amazing about it is you can look at the Constitution and see that the exact opposite judgment was made in this document that we're all taught in grade school is the document that has enshrined core conceptions of not just American justice, but the American character. So if you look, for example, at the Fourth Amendment, it's pretty remarkable that the Fourth Amendment, and then therefore the Constitution, bars the police from simply entering our homes at will. In fact, it bars the police from entering our homes unless they can first go to a court and demonstrate to a court that there's probable cause to believe that we've committed a crime. And the reason why that's so remarkable, that prohibition, is because it really does endanger the public safety, that prohibition. It hamstrings the police in really significant ways. So if there is a rapist on the loose, or a mass murderer, or a serial child molester, it would be far easier for the police to catch that person if they could simply enter everybody's home at will, search through all of our papers, and find that person. But the people who formed the Republic made the decision, one reaffirmed by subsequent generations that revered the Constitution, or claim they did, that there are more important things than safety, that the right to privacy and to be free from those kind of intrusions is a more important value, that we would rather risk people, criminals, dangerous people, those who menace our families or our children, being able to be free and have the police be able to invade our privacy. That's true for all of the rights in the Constitution. We would rather have freedom of speech than be able to ban ideas that are very dangerous. We would rather have criminals go free than put people into prison who haven't been convicted beyond reasonable doubt by a jury of their peers. This is the core value judgment that has been made over and over that has defined United States freedom as we've all been taught it, which is that safety is not the most important value, that what is most important is demanding that the government, not in some circumstances, but all circumstances, not transgress these lines. And what you look in, and if you look now and see what's happening in the United States, and you look at those core freedoms that I just talked about, whether you look at the First Amendment, the idea that government can never abridge freedom of speech, and you can see all kinds of prosecutions in the name of terrorism over the last decade, where people in the United States, mostly American Muslims, but increasingly other forms, other dissidents as well, are being convicted based on the statements they make, or the groups that they support with their money, or even recently people who are indicted for materially supporting terrorism because they upload YouTube clips that are critical of U.S. foreign policy, and therefore, says the government, are designed to advance the aims of terrorists. Or if you look at the Fourth Amendment, the prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures without a search warrant, what you see is this massive American surveillance state that monitors and surveils and records not people for whom the government has probable cause to believe they're doing something wrong, but all of us, no matter how law-abiding and innocent we are. And there are all kinds of examples of that. The one that's always most striking to me is a passage in a Washington Post article from 2010, which was entitled Top Secret America, that reported that every single day, not every year or decade, every single day, the National Security Agency in the United States collects and stores 1.8 billion individual email communications and telephone communications and other form of electronic communications among and by Americans. The massive surveillance state that we've allowed to be constructed essentially surveils and monitors and stores almost everything. The one saving grace is that they surveil so much that it's actually difficult for them to even know what they're collecting. But if you compare what they're doing to what the Constitution says they can't do, which is search and monitor our persons or papers or homes without a search warrant, you see the complete irrelevance of that prohibition in modern American life. And then, of course, the Fifth Amendment prohibition on depriving somebody of life or liberty without due process is being violated over the last decade in all sorts of obvious ways, from imprisoning people indefinitely and increasingly for life. People are dying at Guantanamo without any charges or due process, to now targeting even American citizens for death, execution, only on the say-so of the president, acting in secret with no charges, no due process of any kind. And so what you see are not isolated or ancillary violations of these core limitations, these civil liberties, but systematic ones. And so I think it's really worth asking two questions about the state of civil liberties in the United States to really understand what the real status of it is. The first question is, why is that happening? Why have we allowed these fundamental erosion of these rights that we're all inculcated to believe from childhood are instrumental to who we are? Why has there been so little backlash? And then secondly, what are the implications from allowing these erosions as we've been allowing them? So let me start with that first question. Why has this erosion taken place with so little resistance? And I think there are several important reasons to think about in answering that question. The first one of which is that there is a perception that is propagated by design that these erosions only affect a small, marginalized group of people, and therefore the vast majority of citizens need not worry about them and are not going to be affected by them. This is always the strategy of every power center, every government that wants to abuse power is in the first instance they target for their power abuses the least sympathetic, the most marginalized and most powerless group, with the expectation that most people in the society will either endorse it or simply overlook it because they perceive that it won't affect them. And of course, there have been lots of groups in American history that have served that purpose, and the group that has principally served that purpose over the last decade is American Muslims. So there's lots of people who believe that even though they don't really like the idea all that much of putting someone in a cage for life with no charges, or allowing the president to decide who should be killed without charging them with the crime, they don't really believe that they're going to be affected by that, and so they don't actually care. And I think even for a lot of people, you can see how potent of a dynamic that is, even for a lot of people who do find those policies truly objectionable, which I assume includes a lot of people in this room, if not the majority, if you're not in the targeted group, in the back of your mind, it is easy and tempting to deprioritize those injustices because we don't wake up in every day if you're a non-Muslim in the United States, especially if you're a white non-Muslim, and think that there's a danger, an imminent danger, that a drone is going to be flown over your house and your children are going to be exploded by the bomb that detonates, or that police are going to come and cart you off to Guantanamo or a military brig and hold you there for life without charges. You believe in the back of your mind, even if you're somebody committed to fighting these injustices, that those can be deprioritized because they're not immediately affecting you. And so even for people who aren't truly devoted to those kind of injustices, it's particularly easy to remain apathetic or even to endorse them. And so I think it's worth thinking about just for a minute how to subvert that design. And obviously there's just the immediate issue, the grotesque immorality of deciding that you're only going to care about injustices that affect you directly. But if somebody's in that mindset, it's not going to be very easy or fruitful probably to make a moral appeal to them that they should care because it's just wrong. So you have to really go to a more pragmatic argument about why they should care. And the pragmatic argument, I think, is probably even more compelling, which is that it is never the case that government abuses, that abuses of power, abuses of civil liberty, stay confined to the group that is originally targeted. They always, not sometimes, not usually, they always expand far beyond their original application. And you see this in all sorts of ways in the war on terror. If you look at the Patriot Act, which was enacted justified by the threat of terrorism, and you look at the statistics of how the Patriot Act has been applied, overwhelmingly, the cases in which the Patriot Act has been used by the Justice Department and the US government have nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism. They've been used in all sorts of other unrelated crimes. And if you look at the tactics that the federal government used to entrap Muslims originally in the wake of 9/11, like paying informants, using agent provocateurs, trying to lure them into plots that the FBI itself creates and conceives of and funds, only to then jump in at the last minute and disrupt their own plot and then announce to the world how heroic they are for stopping their own plot, something they just did today. You see that tactic, they just again today saved us from their own plot, for which we all, I hope, are appropriately grateful. You see this tactic now spreading far beyond Muslims to anarchist activists in the United States, people protesting NATO policies, even the Occupy movement. And what you can really see in terms of this threat of expanding beyond the original application is that if you listen to national security officials and compare what they were saying 10 years ago, what they were saying 10 years ago or even 5 years ago is they would say that the greatest national security threat to the United States is al-Qaeda. First it was al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, then it became al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen. Now what they say is the greatest national security threat is homegrown terrorism. Or at best they'll say now that it's actually the threat of cyber warfare happening in the United States. Whole new ways to take these powers that had been confined to foreign nationals outside of the United States and importing them onto domestic soil. So if you see the most recent forms of repression, of erosion of civil liberties, you see them focused on American soil, like the NDAA that Jack began by talking about, like the erosion and dilution of Miranda rights whenever terrorism is concerned, like legislation to strip away citizenship of people who are accused of terrorism. You see the importation of these abuses and the theories that justify them onto American soil, spreading to increasingly diverse forms of dissent and activism far beyond the American Muslim community. So even if you're somebody who thinks that you're happy to ignore injustices if they're not directly affecting you, it's never the case that you can be confident that they won't. And the real problem with ignoring injustices because you think they're only affecting a marginalized group that doesn't include you is that once you allow those injustices to take hold, those erosions of civil liberties to take hold with regard to that group, then the power itself is institutionalized in a way that you can no longer object once it expands. So if you say that you're fine with the government imprisoning people without due process because they're doing it to Muslims and terrorists, then you've not just empowered them to do it to Muslims and terrorists, you've empowered the government to imprison people without due process, period. However they then choose to do it, you have no grounds for objecting. Same with things like surveilling people without warrants or assassinating people without due process. It takes hold and it changes the political culture in which we live. It becomes an embedded and legitimized form of power, and that's the reason why it needs to be objected to when it's first applied even to groups to which we don't belong. The second reason why I think this has been happening with a fair amount of ease and with far too little backlash is that it has all taken place in the context of war. Not just war, but wars plural, what seems to be endless wars in multiple countries. And there's a couple of attributes about war that make civil liberties erosions almost impossible to stop. One is that the nature of war is that in war, leaders become powerful, all-powerful, omnipotent. They operate without restraint. 2,000 years ago, this has always been true, 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, when war begins, the law falls mute. It's the reason that the founder said we want to put really high barriers between the president's ability to start wars and the actual starting of them, because we know that leaders are tempted to start wars because in times of war, they have limitless power. That's just generally the case, that citizens defer far more to their leaders in times of war than in times of peace. But the second attribute of war that makes civil liberties erosions very difficult to resist is that the primary tactic of war that leaders use constantly in war, first and foremost, is the very powerful process of dehumanization. The key to being able to sustain especially long wars is to be able to remove and deny the humanity of those who are targeted with aggression and violence, because all but the most sociopathic citizenries will not withstand their government engaging in massive violence for a decade in their name, because their conscience would be too bothered if they're reminded of the humanity that's being extinguished. And so it's necessary to take the targeted group and dehumanize them, either by rendering them invisible or equating them with something evil and wrong, something that deserves the aggression. And that is the message that has been sent necessarily by the US government to the citizenry about Muslims over and over and over again. Not overtly. People will say, leaders will say, of course we're not at war with Islam. Of course the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. We're not at war with them, just the extremists. But the message and reality that has been sent is that every time we kill a Muslim, it's because they deserve it. We never hear about them, because to hear about them would be to hear about and be forced to think about their humanity. And once you start to dehumanize a group long enough in the minds of the citizenry will start to accept anything done in the name of stopping that group. Torture, constant war, all sorts of civil liberties abridgments. It's very hard to get people to think that they ought to object. That's the reason that war not only kills the people at whom it's aimed, but fundamentally transforms and degrades the character of the nation that fights it for that long. The third reason that I think that these abuses have been able to persist without much resistance is the role that partisan allegiance plays. And in particular, the way in which partisan allegiance has transformed what until a few years ago were known as right-wing radicalism into bipartisan consensus. And this, I think, is a very underappreciated, but to me, the most significant factor in why these particular abuses of the last decade are now so strengthened. And it's really the part of the Obama legacy that I think is most underappreciated. There is this amazing 2008 memo that was prepared by the CIA. And it was prepared and it was designated top secret, but it got leaked to WikiLeaks. They published it, and you can go now read it online. And what makes it so extraordinary was it was written in mid-2008 in the height of the general election. And the CIA's, what prompted this document, this report to be written, was that the CIA was extremely worried about spreading anti-war sentiment in Western Europe. Several anti-Western European governments had just fallen because they were too involved in the war in Afghanistan and their populations were demanding that they withdraw. And the CIA was petrified that as this anti-war sentiment spread in Western Europe, more and more Western European governments would feel compelled to withdraw from the war in Afghanistan and from related wars, and that it would then spread to the American citizenry as well. And what the CIA report concluded was that the best asset to arrest this threat, as they saw it, the threat that peace would come, the best weapon that they had would be the election of Barack Obama. And the reason that they thought that, and it turned out to be quite prescient actually, was because the reason that they thought there was such anti-war sentiment was because they had this, sort of person who was this swaggering, unilateralist, cowboy, evangelical, very repellent to large portions of the Western European population, named George Bush, who had become the face of these wars and therefore made them unpopular. But by replacing that phase with a much prettier, softer, progressive constitutional law phase, who would then become the primary advocate of these wars would become to be seen as humanitarian, as justified, and they'd become much more popular in Western Europe and in the United States. And that's exactly what happened, not only with regard to American aggression and militarism, but with the erosion of civil liberties as well. And I know this, how prescient the CIA was. I know how true that dynamic was, just from my own experience. As I said, I've been speaking about civil liberties in the United States now quite a bit for the last 6 or 7 years. And if 4 years ago I had come to a room like this and spoken in front of, say, 150 people, and he just randomly assembled 150 people, and I stood up and I denounced all the policies that I'm denouncing tonight, you would have half the room, 50% of the room, who would be incredibly hostile to me, who would just be horrified by what I was saying, resistant to it, disgusted by it. Those people were called Republicans. And you would have 50% of the room that would be boisterously supportive. Oh, you're doing such wonderful work. You're defending the Constitution and everything that makes America so wonderful, and you're defending us from this right-wing radicalism, and there'd be all kinds of applause and cheers. Now, 4 years later, if you assembled exactly that same group of people, and I stood up and I made the same exact speech, I denounced the same policies, you would have 80% or 85% of that room that would be hostile to me and would hate me, and maybe 15%, 20% if I'm lucky, on a lucky night, being supportive. And that's because these policies have now become not right-wing radicalism, not the policies of George Bush and Dick Cheney, but the policies of both parties, including the progressive constitutional law scholar whom we elected, and therefore huge numbers of people who found them or who pretended to find them offensive and repellent 3 years ago are now quite supportive of them. I was traveling yesterday, and as a result, I ended up being involuntarily subjected to the horror known as MSNBC. And there was this amazing event that I witnessed that I'm still a little bit traumatized by, but I'm going to share it with you anyway, and maybe that can help me spread the trauma and make it a little less intense and acute. But what happened was, it was before the presidential debate, and they had all these people assembled. They were like waving all these Obama signs and that big O that they all have, and the word forward, the MSNBC viewers basically. And Chris Matthews went into the crowd. It was before the debate, and he decided he was going to go on a field trip and talk to the real people. And this weird species that sometimes the media discovers. And he wanted to know what it was that they would ask one of the candidates, so they had an opportunity to ask a question. And so the first person that he asked in the crowd said, I would ask Mitt Romney why it is that he's waging this vicious war on women. And the whole crowd erupted with all kinds of boisterous cheers, and they all clapped and whistled and did all those things. And then the next person said, I would ask Mitt Romney why he hates the middle class and wants to destroy the middle class and steal from my family and give it to all his rich friends. And everybody cheered and waved the O signs and everything. And then the third person that he went to said, I would like to ask President Obama about drones. And this intense silence descended onto the crowd. It was like somebody had just dropped a horrible smoke bomb in the middle that had a really bad odor. And Chris Matthews said, well, what is it where do you stand on that position? Because he had just said, I want to ask about drones. And he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He said, well, I don't think we should be murdering innocent people with our weapons. And the MSNBC crowd was either ready to like have a rage riot against him and just tear him to shreds, or just go into like severe collective clinical depression. Fortunately, Chris Matthews moved on. And actually what I originally thought was, I think that this is probably the first time, like what the real reaction was is like, wait, we're killing innocent people with drones? Because this is an MSNBC crowd. They don't hear that ever on MSNBC. That MSNBC doesn't talk about the way we're killing innocent people with drones, because they're progressives who, although they claimed to care about these issues 4 years ago, no longer do. But what it really is that because it's President Obama doing it, they're either apathetic or overtly supportive. You saw the Democratic convention, every time Osama bin Laden's corpse was paraded around, there were chants, these creepy jingoistic chants of USA, USA on the part of the Democratic Party. That is what has happened under President Obama. And I think you see that most of all if you compare what the controversies were of the Bush administration. If you look at the civil liberties controversies of the Bush administration that made Democrats and progressives run around screaming about the war on the Constitution and the shredding of our values and all that, what you find were things like George Bush's claimed power to imprison people without due process, or his claimed power to eavesdrop on our conversations without getting judicial review from a court. Those were the controversies that made progressives and Democrats and liberals so vociferous in their warnings and objections about the radicalism descending on the country. And now you look 4 years later, and what you find is a president who doesn't claim the power only to eavesdrop on us without judicial review, although he does, or to imprison people without due process, though he does that too, but he claims the power to assassinate people without judicial review or due process, and doesn't just claim that power, but has exercised it, as Jacob alluded to, as he did when he killed the American Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen at the end of 2010, and then 2 weeks later killed his 16-year-old American son, Abdul Rahman, in total secrecy, no transparency, no explanation, no evidence provided, and at the same time, almost no backlash, no objections from the very same people who claimed 4 years ago to find mere detention and eavesdropping without due process and judicial review so offensive. And so this is what you see is the shielding of these policies, the transformation of them from what they were 3 years ago, the face of right-wing radicalism, into bipartisan consensus, and therefore much more difficult to challenge. The last point I want to make about why these things are so difficult to resist and why we've allowed them to happen is that there is an incredible speed and ease by which radicalism becomes normalized. And I just want to give you one example about what I mean by that and how that happens. If you look back at in the weeks after the 9/11 attack, even in the days after the 9/11 attack, the weeks and probably even a couple months after, the country, almost all factions in the country, the media, the citizenry, the Congress, were incredibly acquiescent to whatever the president wanted. Whatever the government wanted, everybody was willing to give in the name of this crisis. Not everybody, but almost everybody. That was the consensus. And yet when the Bush administration proposed the Patriot Act, even in that climate, so radical and such an abandonment were the detention and surveillance powers that it authorized, that even in that climate you found lots of serious objections. You can go back and read the op-ed pages of major newspapers saying that the Patriot Act is a serious menace to our liberties. And what the Congress did in response to that was they put in a provision that said that the Patriot Act will have to be renewed in 4 years. The powers that it vested will expire in 4 years unless it's renewed. And the premise was that we recognize, said the political class, that these powers that we're vesting are radical and an abandonment of America, but because of the crisis, they're justified. But once the crisis subsides, these powers should go away. We don't want them to become permanent fixtures of our political culture. And yet 4 years later, the Patriot Act got renewed with barely 10 votes in the Senate in opposition, renewed without any reforms, despite abundant evidence that it was being abused. And then 4 years later, in 2009, the Obama administration demanded another renewal of the Patriot Act without reforms. Almost nobody in the Senate objected. Rand Paul was one of the very few who did, quickly got accused by Harry Reid, who took Karl Rove's rhetoric and said that Rand Paul was jeopardizing the country and was going to cause a terrorist attack by impeding renewal of the Patriot Act. It passed very quickly and overwhelmingly. Nobody talks about the Patriot Act anymore. It's not considered controversial. It gets renewed with no opposition because although it was considered radical 9 years ago, it has become completely normalized. And this is the process by which the government incrementally takes more and more abusive powers with less and less resistance, even as we move as far away as we are from 9/11. So the last point I want to make, and I will close with this, is I just want to think about what the implication, the primary implication is of allowing the government to transgress all of those limits that we began by talking about, that civil liberties denote. What is it that is the consequence of that? And there's a few obvious consequences. If we allow the government to punish us for our speech and to criminalize speech, it means we lose the opportunity to engage in activism against the government. If we allow the government to read our emails and listen to our conversations without warrants, we lose the right to privacy. If we allow the government to kill us or imprison us without charges, we lose the ability to resist anything that the government does. But I think the real implication is a little bit more difficult to understand, but more insidious than any of those. And that is that allowing the government to transgress these limits in such fundamental ways fundamentally alters the relationship between the citizenry and the government. And what I mean by that is that in an ideal free society, really almost by definition in a free society, the people who exercise power fear the consequences of what will happen if they abuse the power. They fear the people over whom they're exercising the power. That is what provides the incentive to adhere to the limitations that have been imposed on them. But in a tyranny, by definition, it's exactly the opposite. The people over whom power is exercised fear the government because they believe that there are no limitations that the government is forced to abide by, that the government can essentially do to them anything that they want, that the message that has been sent, these are the lines you can't cross, are now ignored. That's what happens in a tyranny. And what happens is in that kind of a culture, the climate of fear changes what citizens do and what they think they are capable of doing and what freedom and possibility allow. And I just want to share one anecdote, personal anecdote about when I really first realized just how true that was in a really visceral way. It took place in January of 2010, and this really changed the way that I think about so many of these issues. In January 2010, it was the first time that I ever wrote about the organization WikiLeaks. And at that time, most people had not heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they did any of their news-making leaks. And in fact, I hadn't heard about the WikiLeaks at January 2010. And the way that I found out about WikiLeaks was the Pentagon in 2008 had prepared a top-secret report. And in this report, they officially decreed WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. They described how it was posing a profound threat to the national security of the United States, and they plotted ways that they could destroy WikiLeaks, to render it inoperable and destroy their credibility. And ironically enough, this top secret 2008 Pentagon report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it online. And the New York Times found out about it and wrote a very short article about how this strange organization devoted to transparency with this weird Australian founder had been decreed an enemy of the state by the Pentagon, and they were working on destroying it. I read the article, and I remember thinking that any organization that the Pentagon had decreed to be an enemy of the state and was working to destroy was one that merited a lot more attention and probably a lot more support. And so I went and I researched WikiLeaks. And I found that they had done a lot of great things in bringing transparency, but in localized ways to corporate waste dumping in East Africa, lots of corruption in Australia, some deceit on the part of city officials in Berlin over a fire. But I could see the promise of their model, of the transparency that they were trying to bring to the national security state and blow holes in the regime, in the wall of secrecy. And so I wrote a long article about what WikiLeaks was and what they had done and the reasons why I thought that they held such promise. And I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and I posted the audio of the interview. And at the end of that interview, I encouraged people to go and donate money to WikiLeaks because I knew they were sitting on a bunch of important secrets like that video that they showed in Baghdad and lots of other things. But they couldn't process or authenticate it because they had staff constraints and money constraints. So I provided the link to how people could wire money to the group and how they could donate to PayPal through PayPal and other means of donating money to WikiLeaks. And in response to that article, to my encouraging people to go and donate money to WikiLeaks, I had dozens and dozens of people, literally dozens and dozens of people, in all different ways, in the comment section to that article, by email, in events like this, come up to me and basically say something along the lines of, you know, look, I understand and I agree with all the arguments you're making about why WikiLeaks is so important and why they need to be supported. And I actually would like to support WikiLeaks and send them money, but I have a fear that if I wire money to them or if I donate money to them via PayPal, that I'm going to end up on a government list somewhere, or that I'm actually going to be subjected to criminal liability for materially supporting a terrorist group or some other form of criminal misconduct. And what was amazing to me about it was that these were not people who were prone to weird conspiracy and paranoia. Trust me, I recognize people like that from extensive interaction with them. These were people who were very sober and rational. And the reason I found it so striking was because these were American citizens who were voluntarily relinquishing their own core constitutional freedoms, which is what donating money to an organization whose political cause you support is. It's pure free speech and free associational rights. They were giving up those rights because they feared what the government would do to them if they exercised them. And what was so striking to me about that was that, you know, you can offer all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. But if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry out of exercising those rights become worthless. But that's exactly what happens when you have a government that makes as clear as they can make it, and they want to make it clear, that there are no longer limits that they adhere to, that there are no lines that they're unwilling to cross, that they can do anything to people at any time they want, imprisoning them without charges, listening in on their conversations, even now killing them without any due process or transparency of any kind, because it intimidates and it threatens people and puts them in a state of fear against challenging the government in meaningful ways and even exercising their own rights. And that, to me, is the most insidious and significant implication from allowing the government to cross all these lines as we've been doing. So usually when I talk about these things, I like to finish by talking about what can be done about these things, because if you don't do that, there's this danger that you can spread this really dark and ugly gloominess, you know, like, oh my God, I just listened to this person talk for 45 minutes about all the horrible things happening in our country and all the injustices and the formidable forces that are standing in the way of doing anything about it, and I think I'm now ready to go hide under my bed or jump off a bridge or something. And I want to leave time for question and answer, and usually that is the issue that is raised there, and so we can sort of devote that to talking about that if you're so inclined. But the one thing I will say about that issue, the what can we do about it issue, is that the one lesson that I think we should all draw from human history, and not just history in the past, but very recent history as well, is that any human structure, any structure built by other human beings, no matter how powerful and formidable and fortified it seems, can always be subverted and torn down and replaced by other human beings. It's just necessarily the case. And if we're not doing that, if we're not finding the way to do it, it's not because it can't be done, it's simply because we haven't yet invoked the right passion and found the right strategy for doing it. Defeatism is never the appropriate or rational response to coming together and congregating to talk about these things. The reason to come together and congregate and talk about these things is because the more you talk about them and understand them, the easier it is to figure out the ways to subvert them and defeat them. So with that, I thank you very much for listening and look forward to talking more.
I told y'all he was the best. I mean, come on. Okay, now we're going to have the always lively question and answer session. And I guess the best way to do this is if those who want to ask a question would form a line at the microphone here in the center. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as we possibly can with the allotted time remaining. But I would ask you to keep your comments brief and to get to the question as quickly as you can. We don't need a whole speech from each individual. In that way, we can get as many questions in as we can. And you can direct them to individuals or both guys. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? Okay, yes, it's on. So I really like the way you ended your talk, Glenn, and my question is along those lines. As far as what we can do to change, I mean, I don't really see much hope that this is going to change from the inside through politics. You've both mentioned how both sides of the system are pretty much the same. And I'm wondering what either or both of you think about the idea of opting out of the federal government, either at a state level through secession or through nullification, or on an individual level through, tax avoidance and, working in the underground economy, trying to keep yourself off the radar and stay out of the way.
I think that just as a general proposition, without necessarily rejecting those specific proposals, I tend to think that the better approach is to seek out confrontation with people abusing their power rather than find ways to go and kind of hide and insulate yourself from them. Which isn't to say that some of those examples are all about hiding, but I think removing yourself from the kind of matrix in which they're asserting power is to cede the field to them. And I think much more effective, both kind of in terms of breadth and duration, is to find ways to confront them on their playing field, but to level the playing field using asymmetrical tactics. So I think if you look at some of the most effective things that have been done, I think actually WikiLeaks and the leak of Bradley Manning have been one of the very few things to put fear, genuine fear, into the heart of the national security state by using the force of technology to prevent them from maintaining the secrecy on which their abuse of power depends. I think that both the Tea Party movement, the sort of early rendition of it before it got co-opted by the Republican Party, the good rendition of the Tea Party, and the Occupy movement had a lot in common. Those are pretty simple means of coming out and banding together as citizens, and the primary benefit of that was to signal to people who wield power that there are lines that you can cross that can trigger serious unrest, that can pose a real threat. Not saying that it did, but it showed the possibility of it. So I actually think that that kind of head-on confrontation is much better, because ultimately these things that we're talking about, the government, the political culture, the country, its resources are ours to use and not theirs. And so we shouldn't let them use it on the grounds that we're just going to go ahead and say to them that we don't think it's worth the fight, or we think it's better to go and hide in this corner and try and have autonomy that way.
Yeah, and on your question of civil disobedience, we never advocate when a person should engage in that. I mean, it's so dangerous, tax evasion or tax avoidance, that we don't get involved in that because it's an individual decision. There's major consequences. I mean, I endorse what Glenn is saying, but I've always taken the position that while there are people that confront the state on their ground, in their bailiwick, and sometimes it's effective. For example, if the cops stop you on the street and want to open up your trunk or something and you know it's clearly unconstitutional, you can make a stand there. But my feeling has always been that when you're in their court, they're going to win. They have the power there. And you may be able to beat them, you may go to jail and whatever and get acquitted, but my feeling is that we beat them in our arena. Like here, where the power of ideas, they can't combat us here. Or writing an article in the paper, or a letter to an editor, or forwarding articles to your friends. It's that kind of subversive use of ideas on liberty that I think all of a sudden it percolates. I mean, this is how the Berlin Wall came down. Everybody was sort of talking and sharing ideas secretly and signaling with lights and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, something happens that we can't even anticipate. Some catalyst takes place when all of a sudden all these people surface all across the country. And everybody thinks, oh my God, where did that come from? Well, it comes from groups like this that have taken place over a period of time. And that's where we beat them, in our bailiwick.
I would just add to that before we get to the next question. I've worked for Congressman Ron Paul. A lot of his followers, some of my fellow libertarians, want to sort of withdraw from the system, and who can blame them? But I would add that Ron Paul has been successful in challenging the conventional consensus by being a Republican and working within the system and pushing these ideas. So there's ways of challenging things directly that are very effective. I think he's very revolutionary in that respect on his own. But next question, sir.
Hi, thanks. Thanks you both. My question's for you, Glenn. I recently read a report that was leaked last year. I think you probably saw it, I think it's from Palantir Technologies, and they devoted a whole page to you. It was the thread of WikiLeaks, and they devoted a whole page to you, and they pretty much said that people like you need to be stopped to stop WikiLeaks, and you would eventually give up your sort of views to like promote your own career, essentially. Right. So I'm just curious to what you think of that and what your role, past and present, has been related to WikiLeaks, and have you received any threats or intimidation about your connection to WikiLeaks?
Right. Yeah, I didn't think that was a very prescient report, the idea that at some point I was going to start to give up my rights in order to, in the name of career preservation. But what I remember what happened was the way in which those reports came to light was that Anonymous, the group Anonymous, had randomly hacked the email database of a computer security firm. And among the 40,000 emails that they hacked and then published was this report about how, because they were planning on how to get a contract with the Bank of America, which was going to be the target of a WikiLeaks leak, and probably still will be, about how to destroy WikiLeaks before this leak could happen. And what they were talking about doing was trying to target people they thought were important to sustaining public support for WikiLeaks, one of whom was me, and kind of threaten our careers if we didn't stop doing that. And at first I found the whole thing kind of laughable, like the idea was, just they had watched a few too many movies about the CIA or whatever. But the more I investigated them, what I found was that these groups are very serious players in the world of government and the intelligence community. They were working with one of the best connected law firms in Washington, Houghton & Williams, and obviously we're doing this in conjunction with the nation's biggest bank, the Bank of America. And what was most striking to me about it was that it wasn't like a whistleblower decided that this was just a horrible thing and went public with it. We only learned about it because Anonymous just reached in blindly and randomly pulled out 40,000 emails, which happened to include this. And in the long list of people who were participating in this discussion, nobody ever had the slightest inkling that, well, maybe this is sort of not the right thing to do, and it was probably actually illegal in lots of ways, which led me to realize that this was just common, just the way that things are done in that world. I think I'm fortunate. The more you have a platform, I think the more protected you are from these sorts of things. But I have been, in the work that I've done, somewhat surprised. Maybe I was just naive before. Maybe it is just much greater than I think to interact with people who are the targets of very serious repressive measures like that. Just 6 months ago, I wrote an article about this documentary filmmaker, Laura Poitras, who had produced 2 documentaries, one of which was about insurgents in Iraq and humanized them and talked about why they were fighting American forces, and it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. The other was about extremists in Yemen that humanized them and showed why they became extremists. And every single time she comes back into the United States, she's an American citizen, she is met by federal agents at the tarmac of her jet when she deplanes. They take her to a room, interrogate her for hours about where she was, what she was doing, with whom she was meeting. They take her reporter's notebooks, copy them so that they know with whom she's speaking, with whom she's meeting. And they've taken her laptop on several occasions, copied the hard drive. Sometimes they return it, other times they haven't. And this is a serious person. She's never been charged with a crime, but because of her filmmaking, she's not just harassed, but invaded by federal agents at the United States airport, at the border, every single time she comes in. That's happened to WikiLeaks people. If you go into the most Muslim communities in the United States, you see way worse kind of repression, things we don't hear about. And so the type of thing that you just described that you can kind of dismiss as the aberrational acts of some people who are just kind of inebriated with, their own cleverness, really are par for the course. And I think one of the things that happens is if you're somebody who doesn't engage in very threatening dissent, it's easy to keep a distance from these kind of things and therefore convince yourself that it's not really happening in a meaningful way. But ultimately, the true test of freedom is not how obedient and passive citizens are treated. They're always treated well and left alone. It's how dissidents are treated, people who are engaged in truly extreme but still legal political activism. And in the United States, I think you'd be surprised if you go and talk to those people and look deliberately at how those people are treated, the measures to which they're subjected, that the kinds of things that we think about repressive governments elsewhere doing are exactly the kinds of things that are happening to them.
Okay, next question.
Yes, thank you both. I'll just say I work with LaRouche's Political Action Committee. And back in the Bush-Cheney period, we drove a very heavy campaign to impeach Bush and Cheney, right, for the Patriot Act, moving for dictatorship. And one thing we found is when the election came up was that everybody was confident that if they voted for Obama, that it wouldn't be a problem, that we'd have that hope and change, the dictatorship would end, the Patriot Act would be gone, and so forth. But we know now that's not what happened, right? Instead, it's actually gone on steroids, right, in a very serious way.
So what is your question?
Well, my question is that right now we're in a similar situation where a lot of people are relying on an election coming up to be able to solve this problem. Now, I don't think anybody here is very hopeful about Romney being much different than Obama. But what I do want to bring up is, what do we do about this? Because there is the question of an October surprise being brought forth by Obama, some kind of incident to allow him to use the National Defense Authorization Act, or even a surprise after the election so that he wouldn't have to transfer power. Now, Congressman Walter Jones has introduced a resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 107, which I know you're familiar with, where he's, in light of the Obama violating the War Powers Act and taking us into Libya to kill Gaddafi, the move now is to reassert the War Powers Act. I want to see what your view is on that, because people here obviously can push their Congress in to support that. But also I want to find out from you, what do you think about the question of impeachment? Is there merit for impeaching Obama now? And is that actually something that should be done, not simply just to get rid of a president who's conducting crimes, you know, but specific, as opposed to an
Your
election?
question's about the War Powers Act and impeachment. That's what you want to know
Yeah, but
about.
specifically, if it's necessary to do it now as a way of securing that we don't get.
Right. So, okay, I can answer that. So this is what I would say to you. When George Bush got caught eavesdropping on American citizens en masse, even though a federal statute said it's a felony to do so without getting warrants first, and a felony that will have a $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison for each offense, almost nobody objected. In fact, most people thought it was a good thing and warned Democrats not to object. And one of the few people who objected was Russ Feingold, who was in the Senate and kind of had Rand Paul's role on civil liberties back then. And he tried to introduce a resolution that didn't do anything other than to say, it's really not a good idea when the president does exactly that which the criminal law says is a felony. And that he did here, and therefore we, the Senate, want to just sort of say that we disapprove. He got 3 votes in the Senate for that resolution. And in fact, Democrats were furious that he even introduced it and then held hearings on it because they were petrified that it would make Democrats look weak on national security. So he once went on a show when he was talking about this resolution, and he was asked about impeachment. And they said, well, if you really believe that President Bush broke the law, which he obviously did, shouldn't he be impeached? And Feingold said, well, yes, obviously this is right in the strike zone of impeachment, but I can't even get more than 2 of my fellow senators to endorse my little tepid, worthless resolution. So what's the point of talking about impeachment? And that to me is the same perspective that I have. I mean, if you were to ask me, are there things that Obama has done that weren't impeachment, I would say, yeah. I mean, going to war in Libya, even not just without congressional authorization, but even once Congress voted against it, is a violation of the Constitution. Putting people in prison without due process, killing them without due process clearly is as well. But you can't talk about you can't meaningfully talk about remedies that you don't have any chance of actually pursuing. It's a waste of time and energy, at least from my perspective. I think it's self-indulgent to talk about things that you know aren't going to happen. I try and focus myself on realistic outcomes because I think outcomes in political debates are what matter. And before anything like impeachment can happen, we need to change the political culture, the way our fellow citizens think about these issues. And, you know, I'm glad that Walter Jones is doing what he's doing. Bruce Fein, who was supposed to be here, is actually somebody who helped draft that impeachment article. I'm not against it. I'm not demeaning it or belittling it or anything like that. All I'm saying is that I think that what politics has to be about, first and foremost, is outcomes, improving things. And that requires realism and an appreciation of what is truly possible and what isn't, and getting Obama impeached over civil liberties abuses at a time when you can't even get these issues raised in any of the 4 debates is obviously, at least in my view, extremely unrealistic, and therefore not something I choose to devote my time to. But.
Well, and I think, you know, it is important that we fight these rearguard actions of what they're doing, you know, like try to get the Patriot Act repealed. But what I also want to do at this forum, and what we're doing as part of this tour, is to raise people's vision to an entirely new paradigm. I mean, where we lead the world. I mean, take, for example, if we had lived in a system where the government is regulating churches, or we have a public church system for 200 years, and, you know, there's abuse in the churches, there's corruption and so forth. Okay, well, there'd be a group of people saying, you know, let's reform this government church system. Let's make it work better. Let's get better people in office. Let's impeach some of the people that are in it. And yet there'd be some of us saying, hey, let's raise our vision to a higher level and just separate government and religion entirely. Just leave it all out there in the free market so that the government has nothing to do with us. And that's what we're trying to do, is that while the things you're talking about are extremely important, we've always got to think in terms of the higher level of let's replace this system of military empire, militarism, infringements on civil liberties with a different system, a different paradigm, that where there is no big standing military establishment. There's not the out-of-control spending that comes from all this military spending, the debasement of the currency, the national debt, and so forth, where all of a sudden we're talking about an entirely new way of life. And can we do that? Well, of course we can. That's how freedom of religion and freedom of the press and habeas corpus came about. It was because a small group of people said, we don't want to just reform, we want something better. We want a free society.
Okay, we're getting close to time, but we're certainly not over. We've got 6 people left in line. We will get to all 6 of you, but that should probably be the end. With the lady in the back will be the final question. But you next, sir.
Glenn, you're a constitutional law scholar or lawyer, and President.
I was.
All
I'm
right.
so happy to say
Okay, and President Obama is presumably a constitutional law scholar. My question is, what is the attitude of congressional law professors across the country on the issues that you two have been discussing, and would it be possible to use them as a sort of united front to raise these issues?
Well, it's interesting. There used to be a fairly sizable contingent of legal academia that was very outspoken on these issues. That seems to have dissipated almost completely, beginning right around, I'm not sure, but I think it's something like January 20th, 2009 or so. And the reason is that most of those law professors are good liberals, and most good liberals have decided that their primary political objective is to strengthen and protect President Obama and the Democratic Party. And it's sort of encapsulated by Harold Koh, who used to be the dean of Yale Law School. And for 2 decades, Harold Koh devoted himself to scholarship about the excess of executive power and about how executive power has been wildly expanded beyond what the Constitution ever intended, how the War Powers Resolution is actually insufficient, but at least it's a good start. He was the defender of congressional prerogatives. He was the leading scholar against the radicalism of George Bush and Dick Cheney when it came to executive power. He's now the advisor, the legal advisor to the State Department, and has become the #1 advocate defending Barack Obama's expanded executive authority in the realm of assassination, drone attacks, detention, and most amazingly of all, when it came time to wage the war in Libya, he's the one who stood up and said, Obama doesn't need congressional authority to go and fight the war because it's not really a war, it's not even hostilities. We're dropping bombs and sending jet planes and fighter jets over the country, but it's actually short of hostilities. And so what you see, he's sort of a microcosm of what has happened to academia generally, which is that, like most of what the left had been, which was this force representing ideas, it's become just sort of an apparatus in this partisan machine. And so as Obama goes, so too go they. And so it is very difficult to find people in the legal academic community who have been vociferous about objecting to these policies. You can find some, but by and large, the dynamic that I described earlier about partisan allegiance has subsumed them as well.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I would like to start by thanking both of you for coming here to share your time with us. So thank you for coming here. My question is kind of hypothetical. So like right now in America, at least, the Constitution is sort of the guiding principle for what our rights are that the government can interfere with, right? So my question is kind of hypothetical. Let's say we don't have the Constitution, we're just reforming a new government, right? How exactly do we determine what is something that is a right that the government can infringe upon? Like, let's say in America, a specific issue I think that's becoming prominent now is marijuana use, which is currently, the government is, in my opinion at least, interfering on our right to use marijuana if we so please, as long as we're not like getting high and driving a car and crashing into somebody's house or whatever, right? But it's illegal because a lot of people, their current opinion is, well, marijuana is bad, so it should be illegal. And a lot of people say, well, it's all right because, you know, it's victimless crime generally, right? So what would, if you guys are familiar with the non-aggression principle, that's kind of a lot of libertarians think for that's kind of our guiding principle for how you determine what is right that people can do and what is something that the government cannot interfere with, and that's if you're not like being aggressive towards someone else, then they can't come in and interfere. So what is your guys' opinion on how
I know
you
Jacob specifically has no opinion on this. So.
Do you want to answer first?
Yeah, I of course, as a libertarian, I totally subscribe to the non-aggression principle. I mean, that is the core of our philosophy. And I really think it defines so well what we're aiming for as libertarians. I mean, it is the right of a person to live his life any way he chooses, so long as his conduct is peaceful. So on the economic sphere, we would say you have a right to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, engage in enterprise, trade, travel, anything is peaceful. And on the civil liberties side, to be free of these oppressive violations of being carted away for whatever reason without due process and so forth. But your example of the drug war is right on. I mean, I think the drug war epitomizes everything we fight for as libertarians. Because as you say, imagine the audacity of putting us in jail for ingesting a substance that they consider as harmful. I mean, it's just, to me, it's so shocking. When I discovered libertarianism in my late 20s, it was like, and I saw the light, it was like, oh my gosh. I mean, this says it all. You're ingesting something that they deem as harmful. Even though alcohol and tobacco is harmful, but they approve of that. And they abuse people for doing these things. I mean, it's incredible. The good news is that we are winning on the drug war. I mean, I've never seen more articles by the mainstream media publishing things for the end of the war on drugs with cops and federal judges and leaders in Latin American countries and even conservatives now calling for an end of the war on drugs. And if that one goes, it'd be very interesting as to what else is going to go after that. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, okay, so I was going to try and evade that, but all eyes fell upon me and weren't going to let me, so I will answer. You know, what I would say is that I don't actually think that that principle is confined to libertarian precincts. Although it certainly is a hallmark of libertarianism. I think the reason why there is such growing opposition to the drug war is not so much because everyone is starting to recognize that it's just this profound failure, that there's just no point whatsoever to imprisoning huge numbers of our fellow citizens in a cage for taking substances that the government decides they shouldn't take, and that it has an extremely racially disproportionate effect, or any of those reasons, or the waste of money or anything like that. I think the reason is that you know, there are certain common American values that transcend the political spectrum, and one of those is that the government shouldn't be interfering in places where there's no legitimate political or public cause to try and coerce what it is that we're doing. So you see on the left as well, lots of a very strong sense of the government should stay out of our bedrooms and shouldn't be regulating there, or the drug war opposition, I think, is growing on the left as well. And I think this principle is really more one of the Enlightenment, really a driving principle of the Enlightenment, that the proper role of the state and the exercise of political power is to prevent us from harming one another, but not to prevent us from harming ourselves. And so I think that this is really the principle that is animating growing opposition to the drug war, and lots of other growing ideas about what the state should and shouldn't be doing that really transcends the political spectrum. And that's why I think that conversations about the left and the right, in the way that we typically have them, conservative versus liberal, still has some vitality in certain areas, like economic policy principally, but in lots of other areas, I think it tends to obfuscate and divide people unnecessarily, people who have lots of common values and common principles, who, if they came together, would achieve a lot more.
Okay, next question.
This one's probably going to be a little controversial, but it's something that I feel doesn't really get brought up.
It's for Jacob, right?
It's for both of you.
I'm sorry, but we don't allow those kind of questions in forums.
I feel it's something that hardly ever gets brought up, and yet, in my opinion, is one of the biggest attacks on American civil liberties. It's a major attack on freedom of expression and on anonymity, especially online, and privacy that pragmatically protects organizations like WikiLeaks. And aside from that, it results in the dehumanization of a major portion of the population. They're the only group that has to put their names on a registry for their entire life. And that's the topic of sex offender laws and child pornography legislation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually feel pretty strongly on sex offender laws that one of the things that has happened in the United States is that there used to be this sense that the way in which punishment was meted out is that you would have charges filed against you, you would defend yourself from those accusations, and then if you were convicted, you would have a sentence imposed upon you by a court in accordance with the law, and then once you fulfill that sentence, you would no longer be subject to that punishment. You would once again be a free person with all of your rights restored. And we've seen in lots of realms, including the revocation of voting rights for felons based on a lifelong prohibition, even once the punishment expires, that punishment is continuing beyond what the law requires, that we're essentially declaring not acts criminal, but people criminal. And this has happened in particular in the realm of sex offenders, where people are now branded forever as sex offenders. They're put on the internet in registry so that if you search their name, you will find a list of what they've done. You can actually, there's websites now that if you pull up a Google map, it will show you with little arrows where all the registered sex offenders are living. I guess you can like not drive on their street or something. And these are people who have served their sentences, who are no longer under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And I think it is very disturbing because I think that human beings are not criminal, acts are criminal, and there's always been this rehabilitative possibility that once you fulfill your sentence, then you are a free citizen once again. So, I mean, I would agree. I'm not sure it's directly related to all the stuff we're talking about tonight, but I think it is pretty ominous nonetheless in a way that expands the power of the state to punish us and brand us far beyond what the law permits.
I'll just add to that real quick. A friend of a friend back home in South Carolina, where I'm from, if you couldn't tell from the accent, is on a sex offenders list. He got drunk one night and decided to go to the bathroom in public, and the police saw him, and somehow that was a sex crime. So they don't even distinguish between people who got drunk and silly and people who are actual child molesters or something horrible. But that's another problem inherent in government. But next question, sir.
The ACLU and the 10th Amendment Center and Bill of Rights, the Defense Committee, and a few other groups are promoting efforts around the country to exercise the 10th Amendment or nullification powers against the NDAA and lots of other just violations against people's rights. So Virginia, under state law now, the NDAA is ruled unconstitutional. And then there's like 16 or 17 counties or cities across the country. So I wanted to get your reaction or your opinion on that strategy's longevity or promise to build a wider movement and something focused more, in my opinion, something focused more on issues rather than impeaching an individual or going after a certain person or something. And if I could cheat, I just wanted to know also your opinion on the view of the Fifth Amendment as a protection against torture.
Well, I love the ideas of the nullification and so forth. I think anything that can limit federal power is great. And even lesser than that, there's a case out in El Paso where the City Council of El Paso passed a resolution declaring that the war on we should consider legalizing drugs. And then they threatened them with a cutoff of federal aid. Their congressman got upset, and so they backed down. And the guy that led the fight decided to run for Congress against the guy that was, making a fuss about this, and he beat him. And it was on this issue. And I think these acts of resistance to federal tyranny, the state petitioning where they have medical marijuana and so forth, I think all this stuff's fantastic. I forget, the Fifth Amendment, I think clearly it bans torture. And even if there was no Fifth Amendment, I mean, that was the point I wanted to make earlier, is that without a constitution or whatever, rights exist in the individual. They don't come from the Constitution. There is no constitutional rights, because our rights are inherent in us as individuals, and you have a right not to be tortured and abused in that fashion, even if you have been convicted or prosecuted of a crime.
I like your shirt, by the way. Just to add to the nullification, my friend Tom Woods, who's written a book called Nullification, has made the point that a situation like what you have here in California with the medicinal marijuana laws, the fact that for a brief time Obama instructed Eric Holder not to prosecute, is sort of a de facto nullification. It doesn't have to be explicit. It is a state showing resistance and the federal government leaving you alone. So, but thank you for your question. Next question.
Thank you, all three of you, for coming out tonight and sharing your passion and convictions with us. My question should be fairly brief and hopefully lighthearted. I was at a workshop earlier today at UCSD, and it was a leadership workshop, and we were given an exercise to do to hopefully empower us and help us better relate with one another that attended the workshop. We had to write down on our left hand a word that basically motivated us to do the things that we do every day and to strive to be the people that we want to be in the future. So my question is to all three of you, as well as possibly the audience, what motivates you to do the things that you're doing tonight and to be the people that you are right now?
I will answer you by telling you this. One of the things that I'm able to do as a result of the work that I do is go to lots of different places around the country, and I speak at events like this, but then I also meet with people in the places that I am. And one of the things that has happened is that I've really seen firsthand the personal effects that the kind of injustices that we're talking about tonight have on actual people. And I think it's very easy to, if you write about civil liberties and sort of stay cloistered, to think about these injustices in a kind of detached and abstract way. But when you go and meet with, as I did last week, and I'm starting to sound like some presidential candidate, like, oh, I was in Ohio last week, and a woman came up to me and said, so I apologize, but I really did meet last week with this family who were Albanian refugees, and three of this woman's sons, they were Muslim, were convicted in the same case where the FBI created one of these terrorist plots, recruited and manipulated this 20-year-old kid who was really poor and whose brother had cancer and couldn't afford the treatments, and they said, we'll pay you $250,000 if you help us lure these guys into this plot, and they were able to get enough statements from them. Nothing ever happened. No violence ever happened. They were each sentenced to basically life in what are these horrendous, oppressive prisons inside the United States, basically reserved for Muslims, where their communication is restricted. 20 years old, 22 years old, 21 years old. Completely destroyed these people's lives. This happens all over the place. And so when I go and hear these kinds of, from these people, and I really get a sense for how personalized these harms are, that's what really emboldens me to want to keep working on them, even though, I could probably help my career better if I sat around talking about the latest poll or going on like MSNBC to talk about how great Obama is. I'm just not able to get myself to do that when I go around and see the real harm that these kind of injustices have for people.
That's a fascinating question. I do it out of self-interest partly. I really want to be a free person. I mean, you never know when the Lord's going to take you, but it would be nice to know what it's like to live in a free society. And I would like to know that before I die. What's it really like to live the life of a free person? But I'm indignant, like he is. I'm indignant of what they're doing to people. And in my previous pre-libertarian life, I was a liberal. I was the ACLU representative in my community. I believed that government should be helping poor people and so forth. And I was indignant when I grew up on the border of Laredo, Texas and Mexico. I grew up on a farm, and I saw how they were treating illegal aliens, and I just was outraged and indignant. How could you treat poor people like this and profess to love the poor, And I was outraged by it, and it motivated me in the law practice to try to do something about it. And then when I see what they're doing to people in Iraq and people in Iran, I feel it. I mean, you got to put yourself in the shoes of these people that are suffering, the victims of this empire.
and you got to feel that indignity, and you got to be willing to fight. We were talking the other night, the 4 of us, and like, what if there wasn't any chance to win? What if we just can't prevail? Would we do this? And the answer is yeah, because it's the right thing to do.
I still believe in the constitutional republic of the founders. The experiment they began, I still think, is the best system, especially for this country. It fits our history. And we've gotten far away from it. I sort of look at political engagement like the idea of a perfect marriage. Even the person who's in the best marriage possible, the couple involved, will tell you that it's not perfect. But there's an ideal, and they work towards it every day. That's how I look at politics. I don't ever expect to create a utopian society or a perfect constitutional republic, but we can get much closer to that in protecting our liberties and having a better foreign policy, for example, or we can go backwards and be Bush, Obama, possibly President Romney. And you take your openings where you can, you fight where you can, and it's always worth it for the reasons Jacob explained and Glenn. So, good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this will be our final question tonight.
Hi. There was something that Glenn said earlier that made me wonder. You had said something about there being so little backlash to the evaporation of our civil liberties and the grotesque corporate greed and corruption of our political system. And I was wondering if you really think that that there is so little backlash, or if you think that that the forms of suppression and oppression against nonviolent, peaceful resistance groups has been so early and effective that there might really be much more support, but that it's been so effectively crushed. Mm-hmm. And you had said something about, kind of laughing off the whole B of A, H.B. Gary thing, but I think to a lot of other people to anybody that was like paying attention and understood the dots and connected them all, how terrifying that really is. And you said something about it's less scary when you have your own big pulpit and you can fight back. But most people don't have that, and a lot of people are terrified of being maced in the streets and swept up at Occupy and things like that. So how much do you think that is really preventing people from rising up? Because as you had suggested that they can't combat us here, I don't know if, I think that's awesome in theory, but in reality, I don't think that is true, in that like you had said earlier, that if there's some form of oppression that they're doing in one place, you could be sure that that's not the only place. So if they're gonna put people into mosques and on campuses, and that they're probably gonna do it anywhere that there's effective speakers communicating scary ideas to the status quo. So
right. No, I think it's a great question, and lots of great observations embedded in it. So let me just say this about that, which is, I think you have to dichotomize whether there's genuine backlash that's being suppressed because of fear of what the state will do versus apathy. So I think in certain instances there's genuine apathy. I don't think that there's this intense, pervasive anger in the citizenry about the fact that President Obama is routinely killing innocent Muslims in Pakistan and Yemen and the like. And I don't think there's pervasive anger. There's some, but there's not pervasive anger over the fact that we're imprisoning people without due process in Guantanamo, or assassinating even our fellow citizens on the grounds that they're terrorists. I do think, though, that there is pervasive anger over the perception, the obviously accurate perception, that, for example, that government and banks are basically merged, and that people who are on Wall Street making tons of money are completely not just exempt from the law, but that the law is used to enrich them and promote their interest at the expense of everybody else. And I think that was really the impetus for both the Tea Party movement, which arose out of anger over the bailout, and also the Occupy movement, which targeted Wall Street, hence its name, and was as angry about the lack of prosecutions of Wall Street thieves at a time when we're imprisoning more of our citizens who are ordinary and powerless than any country on the earth. So I think that type of anger, and over the lack of economic security and the corruption of our political class, that I think is very real, as you just suggested. And that was exactly what I was saying, was I believe that the planners in the United States and the government and people who wield real power look at what's happening in Greece and Spain and even riots in London and know ultimately that there's going to be real disruption and protest and instability in the United States, because this kind of path can't be sustained. It always leads to that. And one of the reasons that they're importing the kinds of theories that I'm talking about, the importation of these war and terror theories onto domestic soil, is an anticipation of trying to control that unrest and instability by ensuring that now we don't just detain people without due process in Iraq or in Afghanistan, but we can do that in Detroit or in Seattle or in Chicago, all places where these kinds of things are happening. And what you said is exactly what I was trying to get at with the idea of the climate of fear. When the Occupy movement was at its peak, I was on a book tour, and I was way more interested in going to encampments of the Occupy movement than I was talking about my book. And I spent a lot of time in Occupy encampments, and everywhere I went, or if I did radio shows about my book, I would always have people calling in and saying something like, I love the Occupy movement, I want to go down there, but I'm a woman with a child, I'm a man with, a bad leg, or just I've seen what the police are doing. I've seen people shot with tear gas canisters, people pepper sprayed. We were just at UC Davis yesterday where the student body is still traumatized. The purpose of that is exactly what you said, which is to intimidate the population into refraining from any meaningful protest. The idea is to compile force and to use force as a way of pacifying the population and keeping them in fear. That's what we've seen with the way in which our police force has been paramilitarized on a city, state, and local level. And ultimately, what's most insidious about this is that what ends up happening is if you put a population into fear about exercising their own rights, what will start to happen is they will convince themselves that they don't actually want to exercise those rights, because nobody likes to think that there's things you want to do but are afraid to do. So what starts to happen is the population tells itself, well, there's nothing the government is preventing me from doing. There's nothing I want to go and do. I don't want to be protesting the government. I don't want to be objecting. I just am happy with my current state of affairs. And there's this quote from Rosa Luxemburg, the socialist activist, and what she said, and to me this puts it best, is she said, he who does not move does not notice his change. He who does not move does not notice his change. So if you put people into a position where they really don't have rights, but you don't do it by overtly revoking those rights, you do it by making them intimidated and fearful of exercising those rights, they will not even realize that those rights have been taken away. They will convince themselves that their passivity and submission and obedience is by choice, and they won't even realize that they're in a state where their freedom has been deprived. They'll think that they are free, and that's what makes it most pernicious and most insidious. I think that's the plan for how to control the kind of unrest that they anticipate, probably correctly, is inevitable in a society where there's growing economic instability, where there's really no course or path to solve it. That's very likely. And I think that's really the true danger that I was hinting out earlier. It started with Muslims. That's how it was legitimized. But the real aim of it at this point is to generalize these powers, to shield those in power, and to continue to protect their abuses from meaningful resistance. And that, more than anything, is the reason to combat it, because true change will be impossible if those things are allowed to take hold.
Well, let me just use that as a segue. I mean, I totally agree with everything he says, especially on the expansion of the power. But, we are in a situation where we have a meeting like this, and the gendarmes are not at the door, and they're not rounding us up. And in China or in North Korea, they would be, with the kind of things we're saying here. And so we don't have an excuse as Americans. I mean, we are able to do things still that people in other countries can't do. And so there's a greater burden placed on us to bring about change in society. But let me segue into saying that let me thank you for coming to this, but let me also especially thank Yao. I mean, this is one of the most fantastic organizations I've seen come into existence in the many years since I discovered libertarianism. I mean, we've put on this tour now on the East Coast, a little bit of the Midwest, now here, and you guys, we come in and everything's organized so well, and I know how much work goes into planning something like this. You know, everything seems like it's so easy, so smooth. I know it's not like that. There's a lot of work and a lot of planning, getting the venue and stuff, and I want you to know how pleased and how proud we are to partner with you guys in this tour and the previous tour. It's been absolutely fantastic. I mean, we've talked about it on the plane ride. Sometimes tomorrow we get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, but we're loving it. We are having the time of our lives. And thank you very much for your reception. Thank you for coming out this evening, staying this late, and thanks for making us feel at home. We're very, very grateful.
I appreciate y'all coming this evening. It's been great. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you would just give those yellow cards to the gentleman over here on the way out, we would certainly appreciate it. Y'all be safe. Thanks for coming.